Well, hello and welcome to Dev Talks. I am José Morales-Arilla. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the politics department in Princeton University and a research fellow at the Growth Lab here at Harvard. And it is my great pleasure to be welcoming Professors Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith from NYU for a session that will largely revolve around their book titled The Dictator's Handbook, Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics. So without further ado, Professor Bueno de Mesquita.
Really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you all coming out. Oh, yeah.
Better now before you hear the.
I was going to say, I would have waited. So I'm going in, I've got about 10, 15 minutes, so I'm going to be cutting a lot of corners. I'm going to quickly introduce you to Selectorate theory, which we developed with some colleagues. It's a game theoretic model about leader survival, and we're going to use it to talk about why bad behavior is often good politics, and demonstrate some applications of it to real-world problems. So in the Selectorate theory, we think of all organizations, not just governments. We've also studied corporations and so forth. All organizations are set up through a set of nested groups, as opposed to a government is democratic or it's autocratic, and then we have arguments about what does that mean. So we think of every organization as having a population of people who are subject to it, a nominal selectorate, people who have at least a legal say in choosing leaders. Shareholders get to vote, and we as citizens get to vote, and in Saudi Arabia, the royal family has a say, and so on. Real select, we won't worry about today. Winning coalition, which is the portion of the selectorate whose support is essential to keep a leader in power, and it can be made up of blocks, which in questions I'm happy to talk about, sure Alastair is, but otherwise we won't touch on it today. So, whoops. The basic idea is that a leader always has rivals who are trying to take the leader's job. They may be ordinary challengers, they may be revolutionaries, coup plotters, whatever. So in order to stay in power, you have to pay your winning coalition just enough so that they aren't better off defecting to a rival. In this theory, leaders do, in this version of it, three things. They raise revenue through, for example, taxation, and they spend money on public goods to benefit everybody and private goods such as corruption opportunities to benefit members of the winning coalition. And any money that they don't have to spend in equilibrium to fend off the challenger and keep their coalition, succeed in keeping their coalition loyal, is at their discretion. They might choose to spend it on pet projects, civic-minded projects, or they might prefer to have a Swiss bank account. Rivals make the best offer that they possibly can, which means that they make a very big offer today. Go rob the palace blind. But they have the problem that they can't credibly commit to keep you in their winning coalition tomorrow. They want to sort out the coalition to find people who have affinity for them, have some attachment to them, so that they'll be cheap to keep. People who are thinking about defecting from the existing winning coalition to a new, to a challenger, have to think about the lump sum payment, but they also have to think about the flow. And they're confident about the lump sum today, but the flow is problematic. It's risky. And for the incumbent, so the coalition gets reshuffled, gradually people come in and out of it, they're brought in and out. You begin to learn who has higher affinity for you and who has lower affinity. And people who have higher affinity remain in the coalition. People who have lower affinity get booted out. And so you have an expectation that you will, as you survive these shuffles, that you will, with higher probability, continue to get the flow. Whereas if you are distrusted, if you are low affinity type, if the incumbent thinks that you are not reliable, you get ousted, and that's why gulags exist. It's a good place to send you off to. So it's costly not to be trusted. That's a very, very, very brief summary of about 30 years of work, but okay. The theory leads in equilibrium to lots of predictions about behavior. Some of the important ones are summarized here. Thing to be conscious of is that as the coalition gets bigger, we might say more democratic, as you depend on more people, you shift to more public goods because private goods get to be expensive as you have to give them to more and more people. So public goods go up, private goods go down. The longer a leader is in office, the less they spend on the coalition. And as the coalition gets bigger, the more of the revenue that has to be spent in equilibrium to keep the coalition loyal. So there's less discretionary money, less opportunity for kleptocracy, for example. The leader's welfare is strictly decreasing as the coalition gets bigger. Those who are disenfranchised and those who are in the Selectorate, their welfare is strictly increasing as the coalition gets bigger. The welfare of the coalition, we will look at a figure, it's more complex. It looks like the Nike swoosh curve, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Tax rates decrease as the coalition gets bigger, and so on. Productive economic activity increases as coalitions get bigger. Chances of foreign aid decrease, and the amount of foreign aid you get, if you get aid, increases. That's a very quick, again, summary of a lot of stuff. The longer a leader is in office, these are quite new results. It turns out there's a life cycle effect for leaders within the Selectorate framework. It turns out that the longer you're in office, the less you have. So now the people in your coalition have survived the reshuffles, so they know their probability of surviving is going up. It's increased. They're less likely to get tossed out in the future, so they can be bought more cheaply, fewer public goods, a higher ratio of private to public goods, fewer freedoms, but there are fewer coups, fewer revolutions, and reduced leader change. The longer you're in office, the less likely you are to be ousted, except by mortality. So the welfare of the coalition, as I say, looks like this Nike swoosh. The welfare of outsiders just rising as the coalition gets bigger. Two things are happening as the coalition gets larger that leads to the drop. It's an asymmetric drop and then increase. The first thing that happens is you're sharing the private goods with more people, so you're getting fewer private goods. The second thing that's happening is as the coalition gets bigger, to defeat the challenger, you have to spend more of the revenue. So the pie that is being spent on public and private goods is expanding. So even though the proportion of private goods is going down, of course, the total may be going up. And then eventually that curve turns up. And if you look at that red dotted line, there's a very important cut point here. The local maxima, when the coalition is tiny, is in expectation equal to a point, we have it at 0.8, but that's just an example, when the coalition is quite large. Below that cut point is the world of revolutions and coups. If you get past that cut point, the only way to improve the welfare of coalition members is to increase accountability, expand the coalition more. No country, by our estimation, that has passed that cut point has ever had a successful coup or revolution. Okay, so we wanted to do some quick and dirty, easy tests on some of this. So we're interested in two elements here, lots of control variables, and I've shortened this, so they're not listed. And there are year and country fixed effects in these regressions, and they're very simple regressions. So we are interested in the effect that the size of the coalition has on total rewards, public goods, and private goods, since the theory makes predictions about that. And we're also interested in how longevity in office affects those things. So as you can see, bigger coalitions means more total rewards, more public goods, exactly as the theory predicts, and fewer private goods as a proportion of spending, also as the theory predicts. But the longer you're in office, the fewer total rewards you provide, the fewer public goods, and the more the ratio. So that's as predicted. We look at some other effects, freedom of assembly, an indicator of the ability of people to coordinate. That goes down the longer leaders are in office, but it goes up the bigger the coalition. Press restrictions, you get more press restrictions the longer a leader is in office, and fewer as the coalition gets bigger. I should note, by the way, that composition effects run against these results, right? Leaders, for example, who do better survive longer or not. And torture, torture goes up. the longer you've been in office, and it goes down, the bigger the coalition. It's very unpleasant. We have a conjecture. We have not proven this yet. Everything else we have proofs for that I've said so far. The conjecture, which we think we will prove soon, is that as the longer you're in office, the more public goods, the fewer public goods you're producing, public goods are going down, the more that corruption is going up, and the impact on the economy of fewer public goods, less infrastructure, less freedoms to innovate and so forth, and more corruption is that growth goes down. And we see that the longer you've been in office, the lower the growth rate. Composition effects running exactly in the opposite direction here. Size of the coalition does not affect the growth rate significantly. What it does affect is the variance in the growth rate. So in small coalition regimes, some of which produce high economic growth, there's very high variance, especially when you change leaders, very big swings. In large coalition regimes, there's very little variance in the growth rate as you change leaders. It's just this steady slog. Okay, so when governance depends on a large coalition, then societies are wealthier in terms of per capita income. People are healthier, they live longer, lower infant mortality, so on, and they are a lot freer. Their society, their governance is more transparent. We know what the government is doing, and they turn out to be better places to live, which means that they attract a lot of immigrants and they have relatively low immigration. And in fact, empirically, this is as simple, of course, we do much more sophisticated things in the academic work, but as just a simple portrayal as possible, this is the VDEM measure of public goods, looking at 1970 to 2021, and we are looking at the size of the winning coalition as we estimate it, and you can see it's a strong positive effect. More public goods with bigger coalitions. When the coalition is small, on the other hand, we're looking at corruption. Corruption is really high when the coalition is small. It's almost a perfect fit here. And corruption is plummeting as the coalition gets bigger. The few exceptions, like these guys, are oil or petrostates. They don't need to engage in corruption. They got tons of money around. Okay. So we wanted to illustrate how this can be used practically. So we want to give some examples from Ukraine and from the Arab Spring. All of the results I'm going to show you are based on the model being projecting the variable of interest, the dependent variable, 2 years, 1 to 2 years into the future. So these are all, when I say 2000, here's what will happen in 2011, it's based on data from 2009, predicting forward. Okay, so if you pay the coalition enough, a little bit more theory, you get stability. If you pay too little, below that swish curve, then you get instability. And if you pay too much, it's a little bit more complicated. So people like to get paid too much, so that induces some loyalty. But if you pay too much, they have to wonder, why are you doing that? One possibility is uncertainty. So then you should be a good Bayesian, you should be updating, and that overpayment should be dropping. If it's not dropping, you can anticipate a purge is coming. If a purge is coming, the leader can anticipate that people are going to plot a coup to avoid the purge. Okay, so here we looked at the political stability in Ukraine's neighborhood, first in 2019, the next slide will be in 2021, and we see there's only one country that was below the curve in 2019. This is the year that Zelensky came to power. Only Ukraine is below. And you see, the other thing that's interesting is how efficient governments are. The curve is exactly the incumbency constraint. It's paying just enough to defeat the best offer that a rival can make. So everybody else is just about perfectly on the curve, Ukraine below. That tells us Ukraine was looking at a period of change. We go to 2021. I want you to, before we do that, to remember that Belarus is on the curve in 2009, in the projection for 2019. And now we're looking at 2021. Belarus is below the curve, in trouble. Remember, this is projected from 2019 data. And Belarus, in fact, was in trouble in 2021. Ukraine is in trouble. And we see that Russia is above the curve. And if you go back to the previous slide, you'll remember they were on the curve. So they've gone up. They're paying too much, not out of uncertainty, but Putin has chosen to pay too much. Paying too much is a precursor to purges. It could be a precursor to expanding the coalition, but then there's less money for him and his cronies. That would seem unlikely. So I'm taking too long, so I'm going to flash through these. These are details of changes in Ukraine. A lot went on. Arab Spring. So here we are looking at 2011 projection. Oops, oh, there we go. And you can see in the circled area that Yemen is at the peak in terms of revolutionary threat. Right behind Yemen is Egypt, and so on. You can see, for example, Saudi Arabia in 2011 projected not to have any problems. If we repeat this for the risk of coup, we see that in 2011, Egypt is now at the peak. It's way above the global average risk of such events, followed by Tunisia, and so on. When Alastair hears that the fellow who self-immolated in Tunisia is the cause of the Arab Spring, we think, well, but back 2 years earlier, the data were telling us that trouble was coming. And if we look at the 2013-14, we see, this is the period where Morsi gets overthrown. We see, again, Egypt, big risk. And we jump ahead to 2020, we see that Sudan is at the top, and Sudan had a coup in 2020. Again, remembering this is projected 2 years in advance. So to wrap up, when the coalition is large, then good policy and low private goods production improves survival. If leaders engage in corruption, that hurts their prospects. On the other hand, when the coalition is small, good policy is bad politics. It hurts political survival. Corruption is good for political survival when you have a small winning coalition. The best survival prospects arise when the ratio of the coalition to the Selectorate is small, so the costs and the risks of defection are high. So to wrap up, institutions, in this view of the world, shape policy. Leader survival is a function of the ratio of coalition to Selectorate size and of affinity. Leaders anticipate threats, so it's much more important to study when you are interested in instability, their expectation about the coming of threats rather than the realization of threats, because realized threats means a mistake. They should have, when they anticipate, they take counter moves to prevent the threat from being realized. They engage in suppression, extralegal killing, or policy changes which induce institutional change and equilibrium, such as liberalization or autocratization. Sorry, I ran a little over. I'm done.
Thank you so much for this tour de force on the logic of selector theory. I mean, I read the handbooks, the Dictator's Handbook not long ago, and I was, I just loved it because it gave me straight answers for some of the most frustrating political events in my life, right? Like it helped me understand why the illness of Hugo Chavez was managed with such opacity, and right, like why that was so important for the survival of the regime beyond the passing of him. But in the spirit of discussion, let me pose a couple questions, right? Like one of the things that I know is that the theory kind of tells you what happens at different levels of the size of the winning coalition, but it doesn't emphasize enough how the size of the winning coalition can change, right? So I was like, the very first question is like, what does Selectorate theory tell us about the process of democratization? Right, and how do winning coalitions grow when leaders' incentives are to shrink them, and how can the interchangeables, right? What can they do to change this equilibrium into a more democratic one?
Right. So the context Bruce was giving you is very static. So we're thinking of, given the institutions, what is it best for a leader to do? And as Bruce was alluding to, some of the things we've been doing at the end is to think about when is it that leaders are not providing the policies that we would anticipate they would provide, given their institutional settings, how healthy they are, how long they've been in tenure, the economic circumstances, where they're getting their revenue from. So we've been looking in terms of trying to make an assessment about how institutions are changing, looking at where the leaders are over-providing and where the leaders are under-providing. So, for example, Bruce was talking a little bit about Russia there. It wasn't for us just the key that the Russian leadership is providing too many rewards. We've actually been looking in the sense of how are they over-providing those rewards? And the over-provision is that there's a lot more corruption and private goods rewards than we would anticipate, given the institutions that Putin has and given how long he's been in office and the economic conditions and stuff. And so for that is the key as to what the future trajectory of institutions are going to be. So leaders that are over providing freedoms of assembly, for example, providing freedom of assembly, terrible for your institutions in the sense that you might start democratizing. There's an incentive that it's going to be much harder to resist the people if you make it too easy for people to come onto the streets. And so one logical consequence is you're already providing the goods that reward a large coalition. So one easy way to get this disequilibrium to go away is to actually have more inclusive political institutions. So this is the sort of way we've been thinking about trying to bring a dynamic element to what for 25 years we studied as a very static theory.
Super interesting. Another question has to do with this. You know, if you were to distill the core message of the theory, one could argue that it is like more democracy is good because it leads to more public goods. But
well,
hyper-simplifying.
Not if you're leader.
Good for citizens.
Yeah, terrible for leaders.
Correct. But then on that exact point, right, like when we think of the cases of the developmental successes of the East Asian tigers, right? Like these are countries that started with very limited coalitions of government, very dictatorial, and not only were able to develop, but many of them also got to democratize, right? And people argue for them as case studies of modernization theory, right? Like you develop first and then you democratize. It's kind of hard for me to think of these cases as just like, you know, exceptional quirks and, you know, noise in the regression. It's as opposed to perhaps a different institutional context that can also lead to development, right? So how could we think about these cases in the context of selectorate theory?
So I want to go back to comment on this slide that's still up there about the realization of destabilizing events versus their anticipation. So if you look at the Korean case, for example, there was concern about military coups when it was a military regime. When you have people think these big changes are kind of haphazard because a coup hasn't happened, a revolution hasn't happened, but leaders, and we're researching this now, leaders, if they're rational, spend a lot of their time anticipating, am I getting into trouble? And what adjustments do I have to make if I'm getting into trouble? And it turns out that even though leaders would always prefer a smaller winning coalition, there are conditions within this theory under which when I anticipate, for example, a mass uprising, I may be better off expanding the winning coalition, which means producing more public goods, all of which is going to support having a more successful society, to buy off that risk and preserve myself in power rather than I might try to crush it as well. Depends upon what the details of the case are. But there are conditions under which it's in my interest to expand the coalition because it keeps me in power. J.J. Rawlings in Ghana is the classic example of this. There are other cases where it's in my interest. We have a paper in 2009 shows where the cut points are for this, where shrinking the coalition is what's in my interest. And so those places don't become the tigers, they become smaller coalition, more autocratic places. One of the factors that affects this is the conjunction of how long a leader's been in office and how healthy the leader is. So when a leader is believed, for example, to be dying, so they can't be counted on to provide payments in the future because they're going to be dead. So that changes their equilibrium behavior because they want to hang on till they're dead. And that often leads to liberalization. So the theory predicts when you will get the tigers and when you won't. Remembering as well that the theory predicts, with regard to growth specifically, that when the coalition is smaller, there's more uncertainty, and more uncertainty breeds its own problems. The variance in growth is much, much higher in small coalition regimes.
Fantastic. The book also seems to, my recollection of the argument itself is that, we're thinking about strategic leaders that want to stay in power no matter what, right? And that kind of logic might be most certain, most accurate in most cases, but it also leaves very little room for leadership, right? Like, and positive leadership in terms of like leaders that want to expand, that want to democratize their country, that want to, that might be most accurate in most settings, but we're in the Kennedy School, and many people here have been inspired by cases of people that had the chance to be narrow-minded, take over almost power, all the power for themselves, but actually decided to take a different avenue and confront probably the radicals that took them to power and actually allow for the opening of the political system. So on the one hand, it's like a twofold question, right? Like, on the one hand, what's the role of leadership in selectorate theory, if any? But second, how can selectorate theory help inform the decisions and the strategies of democratizing leaders in hard settings, in dictatorial settings?
Right. Our fundamental assumption we make is that leaders want to stay in power. And we just make the assumption you want to be in power. But you can also motivate that by the fact that if you're not in power, you cannot implement the policies that you want to implement. So we're not saying that leaders have no interest in policy. They may actually want to do certain things, but you can't do those if you don't keep your job. And so instrumentally, we're going to work with that assumption. There's a great deal of discretion that leaders have, particularly in small coalition systems. So, I know it's very popular at the moment to think China is this wonderful country and that we should all be dictators because we could get 10% economic growth. And I just like to point out that 100 years ago, China had about the same GDP as the United States. So yes, it can be higher, but it's also, there's those years in the 50s and 60s when they were doing so massively worse. And so there's high variance, but there's a big discretion here in what you want to do. So Deng wants to grow the economy and produces policies that keep him in power and allow him to grow the economy. Mao, before him, chose policies that kept him in power and also impoverished the country and killed, I don't even want to guess how many tens of millions of people, but many millions of people died. So there's a lot of discretion that leaders have. What is very rare is to see leaders take actions that are going to get them in political trouble, and it's going to cost them their job without them being in the position that they're going to lose anyway. So, I mean, I think of very, very few leaders who act against their own political interests.
Let me illustrate this with a real-world example of an unusual case, somebody who ruled two countries simultaneously. Leopold II was King of Belgium from 1869 till he died in 1909. And he was the leader of the Congo Free State. Any place that's called free or called democratic or called people's isn't. In any event, in Belgium, even today, he is revered. Among European leaders, he depended on a relatively large coalition. It was a multi-party system. It was not a super strong constitutional monarchy, but not a really weak monarchy. Leopold promoted the first laws in Europe protecting women's rights, banning child labor, producing free trade, and so forth. He depended on a relatively large coalition. In the Congo, he depended on the force publique, was 200 Europeans, and he did not have the constraint of a large coalition, and his rule of governance was a small coalition leader. I want you to produce, first it was from ivory, later from rubber, X amount of money for me, not for Belgium. This was his money, not Belgium's money. I want you to produce X amount for me. How you get it is your business. Essentially they were tax farmers. You go do whatever you want. They cut off millions of hands. They murdered millions of people, and he became fabulously wealthy. So there was a place for leadership. There was variance in leaders. but the institutions are much more constraining. Same guy, same culture, same personal history. By the way, Mobutu Sese Seko, in case you think it was colonialism, racism, governed the Congo in exactly the same way as Leopold did. In the theory, we recognize that among small coalition leaders, there can be three types. So there's a big pool of discretionary money, and the leaders can be in what we call our Hall of Fame, HAUL. They're stealing tons of money. Mobutu was such a person. Marcos was such a plenty. We can think plenty of such people. Kim Jong-un certainly. Or they could be civic-minded, and among the civic-minded, they come in two flavors. They have good ideas about how to promote social success. Lee Kuan Yew had good ideas. Deng Xiaoping had good ideas, and they can have really bad ideas. Kwame Nkrumah had bad ideas. Mao Zedong had bad ideas. And we tend then selectively, after the fact, to look at the ones who did well and say, oh, this was not so bad. And we look at all these other guys who didn't do so well.
No, that's super clarifying. Then I want to shift gears to the role of international relations in selectorate theory, right? Like on the one hand, one of the theories that has been presented on why some of the East Asian tigers pursued developmental policies was because they were facing foreign threats, right? Like Taiwan from China, South Korea from North Korea. But at the same time, something that you do discuss in the book at some length is this point that debt forgiveness is likely counterproductive because you're removing away the consequences of being extractive, right? Like in a way. So I wanted to perhaps give the opportunity to discuss more about the role of international relations in selectorate theory, and also more precisely, like what's the role of economic sanctions or other economic tools of foreign pressure on dictatorships in terms of like a driver of the potential expansion of winning coalitions?
I mean, I'm always shocked about debt. I mean, if you're a leader and you get to borrow, it's like getting a credit card, going to a nightclub. You can run up the biggest bill you like, and only if you're extremely lucky, you're going to be in power when that credit card bill has to be paid. It's actually shocking to me that people aren't borrowing even more money. Right? It's only a very lucky leader who's going to come around for the consequences of this. And so this is the problem, is that leaders have incentives to borrow because they can, and it's somebody else's problem. And so we're very much of the opinion that the only time we always think about debt problems as not financial problems, but political problems. Because in order to finance or get the economy going enough to make debt payments, you have to implement more liberal policies. You have to let people talk to each other. You have to root out corruption. These are all things in an autocratic small coalition system that are very bad for your survival in power. And so people will, swear blind that they'll reform after you've given them some more money to pay off their debt. But the moment, of course, you paid off the debt, they can pay off who they need to, and the problem goes away. And why would you then implement reforms that are going to make it harder for you to stay in power? So we're very... Killjoys is one of the nicer things we've been called at times. It's the one time leaders are on the hook is when they desperately need money. If we had a policy proposal, one of the things we would say is give me the reform and then we'll give you the money. We're not going to give you the reform on the promise. We're not going to give you the money on a promise of a reform, would be one of our sort of recurring themes we have. If you can't pay your coalition, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to have to change institutions. You're going to have to change policies. That puts you in political jeopardy. If you have the money to pay off supporters, then why worry?
Fantastic. So I have a couple more questions, and maybe we'll get back to those towards the end, but I wanted to give the opportunity to the audience, both on Zoom and here in person, to ask a few questions. So if anyone has a question, we're happy to share the microphone with you.
Hi, thank you so much. One question that I had for this framework is, how do you think an exogenous shock of something like a windfall to make up for current government services would influence that provision long term for different types of winning coalitions? Say that, an outside organization starts providing transfers for low-income peoples in a country. Would that incentivize countries with small minimum coalitions to stop providing those services and instead divert that revenue towards their coalition? Or would that eventually have a different type of impact?
Want to answer or you want
Oh, off you go.
The short answer is it will disincentivize the government from providing better policy. So governments small coalition governments provide some quantity of public goods because they need people to be capable enough to produce so that they can keep the leadership and their coalition in the money and in office. So if you have, it depends on the nature of the windfall. If you have a windfall in your small coalition regime, you have a windfall in the form, for example, of the discovery of natural resource wealth. So the pressures in that case are the resource curse it is to provide less. If you have a large coalition, exactly because you're past this cut point, you can't provide less. So in this understanding of the discovery of natural resource wealth, for example, once you're past this point, you're just going to produce more public goods because you have to. Otherwise, you're going to have people oust you. So it's about what do I have to do in anticipation to prevent the people from rising up or the coalition from rising up. So there are some shocks, some exogenous shocks that work the other way. I mentioned briefly, and we've done papers on this, health shocks. So health shocks are kept secret to the extent that you can. They are more likely to be discovered by people in the winning coalition than by the general society. Health shocks, from the perspective of the coalition, are a signal that flow, which was important in their calculations about staying loyal, is going to dry up. So to offset that threat, I expand the coalition. So there are shocks that will lead me to buy off the threat positively, and an awful lot of shocks that lead me to buy it off negatively.
Thank you. I'm extrapolating the leader term to mean parties in power in a functioning democracy. Would that be a fair understanding?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable way to go. We've just because we're game theorists, so we really like to keep the number of actors nice and small. We have a leader. But I don't have a problem with interpreting as this in a broader sense that there might be two very important positions, or that to some extent political parties may be more of an actor. I don't have a problem with that interpretation. As a game theorist, I'm never going to model. They're just adding. That's just making my life harder.
Sorry, but my question does.
For me, proper nouns are alpha, leader, and peoples 1 through n. I mean, that's my idea of how we should do proper noun research.
But keeping that assumption, I come from India, and we have seen that large coalitions are actually unstable because there are too many competing demands that the government is not able to satisfy. So where is that tipping point where a large coalition goes from being welfare-oriented and stable to unstable and just generally a failure?
First of all, you have to tell me, okay, Bruce is actually an area specialist in Indian politics. He wrote his dissertation.
Oh, no.
It was many centuries ago, but he wrote a dissertation on India.
So we need to keep, so if you remember in the first slide, I had this little thing, blocks, and I said, well, I'm not going to talk about them unless I get pressed. So you just pressed, although you may not realize it. So when, in a nominally democratic society, when people vote as in blocks, so the true size of the winning coalition is smaller than the apparent size of the winning coalition because there is a block leader, an entrepreneur, a village head, whatever, who controls how the bloc votes. India is a much smaller winning coalition system than the electoral structure might lead one to infer. It's also why it's more corrupt than one might infer. Bloc voting does a lot of things. It also goes to your earlier question. We've written several papers on bloc formation and so forth. So when you move to a world in which there are voting blocs, so now you have to move to a world where leaders, instead of doing revenue, public goods, and private goods, they do revenue, public goods, private goods, and club goods. So the club goods are things that are public for those in the bloc, and those not in the bloc are excluded from them. So it distorts the economy in more complex ways than when there aren't blocs. And India is a classic bloc voting society, so it just muddies the water. The math is just so much harder, so much more complicated. Is that bloc? This is a caste. So caste could be a bloc. As Alastair mentioned, I started my career as an Indianist. My first two books were on India, and I pretty much got driven out of Indian studies by suggesting that caste was not nearly as important a variable as Indianists thought it was, because there were many other forms of blocs. And in particular, when you get down to the local level of elections, in any given electoral district, the competing parties have generally worked out which is going to be the dominant caste, and so all the candidates from the different parties are from the same caste, so it's irrelevant. Then what's relevant are other considerations. Occupation, which is correlated with caste, but not perfectly, a variety of other sorts of things, which makes it complicated.
Thank you very much. My name is Therese. I'm from the DRC. So thank you also for mentioning King Leopold and Mobutu and the interesting transitions. I'd be very interested to know from you if you have, from your studies, any insights on the reasons why leaders do leave power. So when we look at the African continent, we have cases like Ghana, Senegal, recently in Kenya, where we have transitions of power according to the legal framework. But we also have where it just doesn't seem to want to end. So what motivates certain leaders to actually be comfortable with the idea of leaving power? Is it the legal framework? Is it whatever protection that they are given? In the DRC, for instance, presidents are senators for life and therefore have some kind of legal immunity. Is it a coalition that they are transferring with them, carrying along with them? Is there a coexistence of coalitions that, provide some kind of protection for these former leaders? I'd be very interested to know if you have any insights.
So, with regard to term limits are endogenous. They are strategic consequences of the institutional structure. In a large coalition system, they are a way to ensure that other people can get rid of you and come in. In smaller coalition systems, so among the work that the two of us have done on blocs, is that even in a one-party state with a strong leader, the leader has incentives to create factions within the party, because essentially people will free ride if there are no rewards for making effort on the leader's behalf. If there's no faction competing with another faction, there's no reason, you get the collective action problem. A consequence of that factionalization is the emergence of rival leaders who then try to endogenize term limits. Do leaders leave office absent an institutional structure to lead them to leave office? I supervised a master's thesis a few years ago by a student who was sure that this theory was crazy, because he was sure that leaders are not that keen for power and they leave office. So he studied hundreds and hundreds of leaders. He asked Democratic leaders, Another student did not democratic. He has a set of simple questions. In a democracy, in expectation, were you going to lose re-election if you were not term limited? If you were going to lose, so the party wouldn't give you the nomination, they'd push you out, so you were out. It wasn't that you chose to be out. You didn't. Now you might have announced, but you didn't have a choice. Leaders who say, "I'm leaving office because of ill health," which we generally treat as dismissive. It turns out they die much sooner than leaders who don't leave office having said that they are sick. They, in fact, are sick. Anyway, he went through all the reasonable alternatives. Out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of leaders, he found 4 who left office without there being an obvious pressure that led them to leave. Well, one of them became the president of the European Union, or whatever the right title is, so maybe that was a move up. One became CEO of one of the world's biggest corporations, so maybe that was. So that left 2 who left office for no apparent reason. Leaders don't leave office. They want power. Take a look at Donald Trump.
So I'm going to move to a question from the audience on Zoom. And I'm going to complement it a little bit. So the question is, how does selectorate theory explain democratization in Europe in the 19th century? And just to complement it, right, like a lot of the conversation on that particular period of time has focused on this idea of, communism and the threat of revolution as a factor that invited elites to democratize. But I wonder if, because selectorate theory focuses a little more on elite dynamics and who's in and who's out among the potential, around within the real selectorate, right? How does that talk about the population, the possibility of revolution and collective action and communism in that period?
So we need to know 19th century Europe. You want to, maybe, if you ask me about the Concordat of Worms, 1122, I'm going to do better, but okay, we'll give it a shot. So the fear of revolution should not be lightly dismissed. I go back to this. Mr. Marx, who didn't have the benefits of this theory, believed that revolution was most likely up here in this tip. The advanced capitalist societies, almost all of which were democratic. So it turns out if you're, according to selectorate logic, if you're above this cut point, you are essentially immune from revolution. Mr. Marx had exactly the wrong places as the candidates for revolution. So if leaders feared and anticipated the risk of revolution, the way you buy off revolution as opposed to coup is to expand the coalition. The 19th century is a period of intense revolutionary ferment in Europe. So I'm winging it because I don't know, not an expert on the period, but that's perfectly consistent that the threat of revolution dominated the threat of coup in the 19th century in much of Europe. When the threat of revolution dominates, this is the current book we're writing, when the threat of revolution dominates, the solution to staying in power is to expand the coalition. So buying off the threat, so creating what Lenin later called trade union mentality, making people content. So when you move past that cut point, you've secured yourself. So I think it's a story at the moment. I haven't tested this, but it seems like a perfectly plausible explanation within the logic of the theory of why so much of Western Europe became democratic. Now, there are other reasons, which we don't have time for, which do in fact have to do with the Concordat of Worms, which created an altered incentive structure in the competition between the church and monarchs. I recommend everybody read The Invention of Power, Popes, Kings, and the Birth of the West, and your 1,000 closest friends will want copies. You'll get the answer there.
Fantastic. So one question I also had has to do with the topic of technology and democracy, right? The book is not super optimistic in general, but But towards the end, there's this argument on the role that technology could play by enabling, transparency, but also by enabling participation, right? At the same time, it's perhaps this is a developed country logic, right? Like maybe this is not the case in developing countries or more authoritarian settings, but it's hard to look at the state of like developed democracies today and think that social media is having a super positive role in the health of our democracy. So I was just wondering how you're thinking about technology in the context of selector theory and perhaps in this like deep end of the.
We should probably preface this by Bruce and I have like the worst social media presence ever. If this doesn't involve like children or grandchildren at a barbecue, generally we don't have anything to do with social media. That said, it's a technology that enables people to talk to each other, which thinking sort of 10 years ago, people were very optimistic that this would allow groups to coordinate. It's also a technology that allows, technology allows high levels of social surveillance. So, under the guise of COVID awareness, China has basically found a way to monitor the interactions, the travel of every single person. So technology bites both ways. And I tend to think of this, I personally think we're a little obsessed with this idea of the internet and social media. It's probably not a lot of difference from the advent of television or radio or the mass printing press. It shapes things up. It gives people a different set of tools, but it hasn't changed the fundamental incentives that people have. The disenfranchised want a more inclusive society, because even if they don't become part of the elite, the society is going to generate public goods for them. The leader would like to be beholden to as fewer people as possible and pick those people from as large a group as possible. And the sort of super interesting thing is the coalition could be really happy in a mass democracy like, I'm going to say, South Korea. And they could also be pretty happy in a very tiny winning coalition, something like North Korea. I think we shouldn't underestimate how materially well off the very few elites are in North Korea. So there's the coalition can go in various ways, and technology is just a tool that people can use to coordinate, to push through the agendas. But our focus is not on that sort of tactical, how do I get people to turn on the streets? It's what incentives do people have to get on the streets? So we're going to pass.
A teeny piece of other optimism. So in the second edition of the Dictator's Handbook, we've added a chapter whose title is Democracy Fragile? And the answer is no. Because if you're past this cut point, you're not going to have successful coups and revolutions. So there is a reason to be optimistic, and there is an incentive for people who live just below the cut point to try to push their society over it.
Fantastic. So we have probably time for 2 more questions. There.
So I read the book a couple of years ago, and I'm Venezuelan, so I was very bullish on the impact of sanctions on reducing the availability of funds to buy people off, etc. And we might argue that the impact of that they sort of caused a recomposition from public goodies to club and public goods, but it also didn't catalyze a coup. And we had Chris Blattman here not so long ago, and he has a paper that shows that negative shocks, commodity price negative shocks, don't necessarily increase the probability of a coup. And I'm very puzzled by that conclusion, and I wanted to know your opinion on whether the reason why there's less availability of funds matter. In terms of how the people who need to be paid off decide to defect or not.
Well, I think we want to be a little less optimistic about the way sanctions work. So I'll talk a case I know a little bit more about, and that's sort of the sanctions against Iraq, against Saddam Hussein's regime. So one of the nominal reason was we're going to restrict access, we're going to drive the Iraqi economy into the ground, there'll be less money. But it turned out for the elites, smuggling became an incredibly lucrative business. And if you happen to be in charge of the borders, you get to choose who gets to smuggle goods, medicines, baby formula, luxury items that have now massively increased in price. And you get to control who gets to bring those across the border. And so it was actually a way of funneling resources into the pockets of elites. It harms the economy as a whole. The economy is smaller, but that doesn't necessarily mean the access to rewarding elites is the same. I don't know the hugest amount about Russia, but I worry that a lot of the sanctions we've had have been completely ineffectual. There's chasing down financial assets and stuff. Two consequences. Well, Europeans have refused, they haven't given up buying Russian oil and gas, and the price has gone up. So the revenue from that has actually gone up, not down. And to the extent of regular economic activities, it's made the elites more beholden on the center, on the regime, on Putin, because that's the only place there are actual resources coming through, because the rest of the economy where they might have enjoyed some privilege but could make money with some independence has disappeared. So it's made everything, I always like to think of it's better to have a small pie and choose who gets to eat than have a big pie that everyone can feed themselves from, right? Clearly the latter is better for society, but the former is much better for the leader. And that's, so I've never been a big optimist on sanctions working.
Have time for one more question?
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm Ricardo Hausman. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Ukraine and the Arab Spring. And I saw that sort of like the model predicted the outcome, but I didn't understand why. What in the model predicted the outcome? I know a little bit about, in my mind, in some sense, Mubarak was trying to widen the coalition in the last decades and liberalize some, but and in the case of Ukraine, I was thinking there was this, the political divide was on the issue, should we move west or should we move east? And there was, maybe the leader wanted to keep it in the, and that's what led to the 2014 revolution. But I didn't know how to think of it in terms of the Selectorate theory. So,
well, let me give you just the real sort of quick how we go about doing those predictions. So we anticipate that a leader's context, their age, their financial situation, the institutions they have are going to shape the policy choices that they have. So I'll give you the real quick, 2-minute recipe for how to do this. So we run a regression and think about how much public goods are you providing, how many private goods, how much freedoms are you providing. And then what we're really interested in is how are you off? So if you were just to think of this, I'm assuming everyone does regression here. We're just in some sense thinking of the residual. To what extent are you offshooting the policies that we would expect you to have? And then from those policies, we can see the kind of errors you might think in terms of how the policies differ from what you expect lead us to too many private goods are going to increase the risk of coup. Too many freedoms and not enough private goods are going to lead to mass uprisings and a likelihood that institutions are going to liberalize. So that's sort of where those numbers came from. And then you asked this question that had something to do with proper nouns. So I got very confused. But that's the sort of secret sauce, is if that's sort of helpful. But Bruce has heard of proper nouns.
So one of the things, as this picture shows us, is people tend to look at what a government is doing, as opposed to what a government is doing relative to the size of its winning coalition and relative to the size of its Selectorate, which we're not plotting here. Because they think of governments in categorical ways. They're democratic, they're autocratic. So it's not in some absolute sense that Ukraine was producing if they were producing, look at the list here, they were producing too few public goods in 2000, coming into the period running into 2019. Not for the size of their economy, not for their location or the nature of their economy, but relative to how big a coalition they had to keep loyal. So once you look at it, which inherently means you're looking at it in a Selectorate way, once you look at what they're providing, not in some absolute sense of are they making people well off or not, but relative to what in equilibrium keeps their coalition loyal rather than defecting at this size of constraint on coalition and Selectorate size, then you see whether they are vulnerable because they're not doing enough. I mean, in the case of Ukraine, if we go back here, so if the coalition, if they're providing exactly what they were providing, but instead of the coalition being at around 0.70 something, if the coalition had been down here to around 0.6, they would have been fine. That would have been an equilibrium provision. If they had looked more east and actually done what their eastern neighbors were doing, smaller coalition, the regime would have been stable, so they might have gotten mass uprising. And they could have also done more, but this picture is exclusively in the view of a Selectorate framework. Am I producing good social welfare? Am I producing the right amount to defeat rivals?
Yeah, what we're not showing on this picture is what the mix of goods is. So we're just looking here at sort of the sum of how much stuff. Could be we could argue about whether adding up the value of different policies is a good plan, but that's sort of how we did it because we had to do something. But these pictures don't show the mixes, and off the top of my head, I can't remember what the mix is.
This is very simple cut at it. We have much more detailed cuts, but only 10, 15 minutes.
I think we could spend the day asking questions and trying to understand the world much better from the view of Selectorate theory, but in the interest of time, just join me in thanking professors Bueno, Mesquita, and Smith for today's talk.